ceremonies, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Zimbabwe, in absentia, Professor Liven Nakura, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Professor Mwati, the visitors, esteemed visitors from outside Zimbabwe, academics, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. My commander of the Defense Forces, General Spanda, was invited to come and present this paper on this now, and because of other exigencies, I'm doing it on his behalf. The paper, which is on the implications of social media for national security in Zimbabwe, the case of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, is going to try and expose to you how we in the military view the case of social media. However, with my long history in the military, starting in 1977, when I joined the liberation struggle, and later serving in the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, the one thing which has always preoccupied me is about the security implications of my job and how secretive it is supposed to be if it is going to serve this purpose of protecting the people of Zimbabwe. At times, it has become so secretive that I don't even know much about it. That is how I'm going to be talking to your expectations about what happens deep in the military may not be met because of that very reason. Ladies and gentlemen, the introduction of the social media has significantly improved communication among individuals, communities, and organizations throughout the world. Social media has considerably revolutionized information dissemination, which previously was an exclusive responsibility of traditional media. Groves and demos posit along those lines. Disseminating information, educating and entertaining the public, which used to be the exclusive role of traditional media, are now conducted in a modern and quicker way through the social media. Consequently, many facets of human endeavor, including national security, have embraced the use of the social media in their activities. And according to Chiatwa 2014, popular conventional uses of the social media in Zimbabwe include both social networking and business activities such as business marketing, political campaigning, research, entertainment, news, and education. The use of most social media platforms in Zimbabwe are relatively inexpensive. Hence, the majority of the citizens can easily access them, and this gives credence to what the master of ceremony just mentioned when he indicated that social media is more about empowerment. For example, it only costs citizens using WhatsApp as little as $1 to buy data bundles that can be used by an individual for a week, sending text messages and pictures to different destinations across the globe. Kaplan and Inlin define the social media as a group of internet-based applications that build on ideological and technological foundations of the web, which allows the creation and exchange of user-generated content. The same authors note that social media are run through internet networks that include platforms such as Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter, among a host of others. They further observe that social media platforms use communication devices such as internet-linked computers, mobile phones, iPads, and others. The platforms offer a better alternative means of mass communication to the traditional media in terms of greater speed, easier access, lower costs, and other convenience-related benefits. They also employ modern information communication technologies that produce, store, and distribute multimedia messaging, text messaging, and mobiles. While the social media has introduced a new robust access to information, dissemination, and sharing, it is a fact that if adequate control measures are not put in place, they can pose a serious threat to national security. According to Paleri, national security is the measurable state of a country's capability to overcome multidimensional threats to the well-being of its people and its survival as a nation state at any given time. This is achieved by balancing all instruments of state policy through good governance. Security is in an objective sense, entails the absence of threats to acquired values, while in a subjective sense, the absence of fear in such values will be attacked. If necessary, the nation can even go to war to prevent such acquired values from being attacked. The concept of national security is often viewed from a narrow traditional perspective that relates to the threat, use, and control of military force. This view is in line with Buzan's definition, which is just that security is pursuit of freedom from threats. The threats under discussion may either be real or perceived. To that end, different nations may therefore relate differently to the same threats. Contemporary national security, however, extends beyond traditional security. It expands national security from exclusively military to political, economic, and social and environmental sectors. Whilst national security entails the collective protection of national interests, the concept can be deepened vertically to cover referent objects other than the state. To that end, national security considers individuals, social groups, and humanity as a whole. As some information is hazardous to citizens, nations have found usage of their security apparatus to monitor, censor, and present the propagation of certain information to their nationals. When we look at social media use in the 21st century, conventional usage of the social media present many advantages to users of this robust communication technology. Discussing merits of using the social media Powell et al. Posit that the introduction of the new media has significantly improved communication among individuals, community, and organizations. The same authors observed that social media platforms have considerably revolutionized information dissemination, which was the exclusive responsibility of traditional media, whose role has always been to inform, educate, and entertain the public. While the advent of the social media has improved communication and has benefited many sectors of human endeavor, the new communication technologies brought their fair share of challenges. In 2010, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya faced massive anti-government protests dubbed the Arab Spring, which led to the overthrow of sitting governments. The anti-government protests that demanded political change in those countries were coordinated using social media. After the success of social media-driven political revolutions in the North African countries, similar demonstrations spread to other parts of the globe in the form of Occupy movements in Europe and the United States of America. Since then, there's been much scholarship on the theme of social media as an empowering tool to challenge the old established centers of power. In Kenya, Twitter and Facebook were used by organizers of the Occupy Parliament movement to mobilize support for their protests. Other cases where the social media was used in political protests include the Twitter movement, Road Must Fall, in South Africa, which was used to mobilize against racism at the University of Cape Town. In Ethiopia, social media was also used to mobilize people to join the Oromo protests, and this is according to Amnesty International. And in Zimbabwe, use of social media has considerably increased in tandem with internet penetration. Chiadra 2014 notes that use of social media in Zimbabwe significantly increased from year 2009 when mobile telephone service providers widened the reach of their internet services in the country. Since then, more and more people have accessed different social media sites, especially Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter. Zimbabwe's internet penetration is one of the fastest growing on the African continent, and this is according to the UNDP report of 2015. High internet penetration and the rapid growth in use of the social media have opened Zimbabwe to possible social media challenges. That notwithstanding, most people in Zimbabwe have significantly benefited from the use of social media in a number of ways, including business, marketing, political campaigning, research, social networking, entertainment, news, and education. While social media have become dependable platforms for breaking news, some of the news, however, have been fed with the potential to cause general despondency, resulting in civil disturbances, which are a threat to national security. While Zimbabwe has enjoyed relative peace since the country attained independence from colonial rule in 1918, increased internet penetration and the proliferation of the social media seem to be presenting considerable national political groups, civic organizations, and other activists has become a serious security threat against the country. Exacerbating the social media threat is access to low-cost and free social media, which are also free from state control. As the ZDF, our constitutional mandate, as provided for in Section 212 of Chapter 11 of the Constitution, Defense Forces is to protect Zimbabwe, its national security and interests, and its territorial integrity, and to uphold the Constitution. While protection of Zimbabwe's internal security is one of the broad goals of the Defense Forces, threats to internal security often turn out to be the greatest threat to national security. Based on local and international experience, it is widely acknowledged that internal disturbances are largely coordinated through use of social media platforms, as alluded to before. It therefore becomes imperative that the defense establishment takes a keen interest in the operations of social media in order to contain these threats. Nations resort to use of the military to complement efforts of their internal security agents. Whilst the advanced world has established cyber commands to monitor social media activities, the majority of countries in the sub-Saharan Africa are still striving to keep pace with technological advancements. In this regard, Zimbabwe is still going through some learning curve. So, yes, whilst there might be some outcries out there about state attempts to control the social media, we are not alone in this endeavor, and the more may still be there to come as far as controls are concerned. As has been the case in the Arab Spring, increased access and effective use of social media platforms are susceptible to abuse by political malcontents in society and other groups who may harbor ulterior motives. These political activist groups are believed to have spearheaded anti-government violent protests that rocked Zimbabwe's major cities in the past. For instance, this flag movement, we should all be aware of this one, used the social media to organize the Shutdown Zimbabwe campaign in 2016, which resulted in a national job stairway and the banning of free market stores at Copacabana in Harare in 2017 that resulted in malicious damage to property and injuries to innocent people. Specific to the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, the Zimbabwe Defense Forces has not officially adopted the use of the social media as a medium of information dissemination within its organization and with its publics. This is an area we are now investing in, especially after the advent of Operation Restore Legacy. We continue to use traditional communication, whilst the organization cannot bar its members from using social media platforms in their individual capacities. Efforts are always made to educate and conscientize members about the dark side of the social media. We therefore continue to educate ZDF members to be analytical of the information obtained through social media. We also prohibit transmission of official information through these non-traditional platforms. And one may ask why we are doing this. The public, in a number of instances, has been fleeced of their resources through false messages on social media pertaining to recruitment and other activities of the defense forces, which will actually be based on falsehoods. A little reference to Operation Restore Legacy. Operation Restore Legacy was mounted by the Zimbabwe Defense Forces November 2017 to help contain a deteriorating political and economic situation in the country that was going to cause serious national security threats. This required the ZDF to take extraordinary measures to uphold the country's constitution as mandated. During the media-driven operation, it was necessary for the ZDF to timelessly disseminate information to keep the population and the rest of the international community informed of the unfolding situation. Use of social media became handy in quick dissemination of information to the media, especially for coordinating press conferences and information dissemination on the developing operation. The ZDF could assemble both local and foreign media for briefings in less than an hour, and the information could reach the wider audience across the globe almost in real time. Regular press briefings to the media helped reduce distortions of information and kept speculation. The ZDF in this instance therefore won the media war, since by and large the organization got both the local and international support necessary for the success of the operation. And the media threats to Zimbabwe's national security. Major security challenges posed by the social media emanate from structural weaknesses of the platforms. One other complication is the location of the social media servers, which are hosted in other countries, and Zimbabwe may be unable to influence. Furthermore, the WhatsApp platform has an inbuilt end-to-end encryption that cannot be broken without control of the platform servers. The Zimbabwe Defense Forces has therefore been grappling with social media-related security challenges as highlighted below. Firstly, establishment forces have been disseminating information based on breeding discord in the Zimbabwe Defense Forces with a view to cause unrest and mutiny. For example, they have spread falsehoods through the social media to the effect that lucrative packs were given to generals and senior officers as rewards for successful conduct of Operation Restore Legacy, whilst lower ranks benefited nothing for their role. And this is the falsehood. Nothing like that ever happened. Other divisive reports allege that generals and senior officers have been paid at current directly into their individual accounts or in an effort to misinform members, create divisions, and generate rebellion within the defense force. Concerted efforts have been made by anti-establishment groups and individuals to alienate the ZDF from the public through propagation of wrong information. Several false reports have also been generated through the social media, alleging that the Zimbabwe Defense Force members are deployed in rural areas to harass and intimidate the electorate in a bid to garner support for the ruling party in the forthcoming harmonized election scheduled for 30 July. Social media has also been used to circulate unauthorized classified documents, the unofficial disclosure of which is detrimental to national security. And in order to contain these threats, a number of strategies have been adopted by the Defense Force, and these include, among others, training of personnel, effective communication, civic military education, and looking at possible legislation. And ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, while Zimbabwe continues to enjoy relative peace, increased internet penetration, and proliferation of the social media are presenting considerable national security challenges, threatening peace and security in the country. It is therefore imperative for the Zimbabwe Defense Forces to be conscious of the threats to national security posed by the use of social media. Members should remain alert for them to be able to deal decisively with the threats posed by the use of social media to national security, whenever they manifest, to ensure that official information is protected from malcontents. Whilst that is the case, benefits accruing from the introduction of social media in the form of ease of accessibility, coverage, speed, and efficiency should not be overshadowed by the negatives. Hence, organizations, the ZDF included, must embrace their responsible use, bearing in mind that there is no reversal to this development. Whilst the organization cannot bar its members from using the different social media platforms in their individual capacities, efforts should always be made to conscientize the members on the security threats posed by social media. Ladies and gentlemen, the Defense Force is known for hierarchy and discipline. This is one area where hierarchy and discipline have been extensively challenged. You cannot control your members from using social media. Hence, the imperative is that as a nation, we must develop a value-based system for the responsible use of social media. We must use social media for the benefit of development, growth, ensuring that we are all responsible. If you can't control it, if you can't stop it, embrace, but do so responsibly. I thank you.
Thank you, Major General Martin Chedonko, for an insightful presentation in terms of national security matters pertaining social media in Zimbabwe. In his presentation, he highlighted the benefits and negatives of social media, especially looking at it from the ZDF perspective. And something that he highlighted towards the end, the issue of hierarchy and discipline. And I think the issue of discipline on the social media is something that maybe is a responsibility for each one of us as we use the social media. If we are disciplined, I'm sure it will be for our benefit. He also talked about the civil disturbances in terms of the use of social media, where he was focusing at the threat to national security. He looked at issues to do with abuse, threats to internal security. I'm sure we are all concerned with our internal security. The ZDF is not sleeping on that matter. They are always alert to that effect, that the national security is not a threat. He also mentioned the implications of social media in terms of spreading of falsehoods via social media. I'm sure we are all aware of that. I think as individuals, we are supposed to also take time to do some background research each time we are using social media and look at the authenticity of material that will be there on the social media. And he also talked about the issue of the strategies that the ZDF is implementing in order to curb the abuse of social media. I think we have learned a lot from the ZDF perspective, and from what the Major General was saying, we are comfortable because we are so sure that our internal security is kept in check by the ZDF. They are doing their job. Okay, we can take 3 questions relating to the presentation. If you have any questions, contributions. Okay, thank you. Okay, 1, 2. Okay, so we only have 3. So we are doing those 3 questions because of time. Okay, we can start.
Okay. Thank you, Major General, for your presentation. I was very fascinated, and you really spoke like a general. I appreciate that you have given us a very broad and accurate definition of national security, and that it is often narrowly conceptualized as only relating to the military, which is all as you have outlined. However, I have a different view of what you were saying from a legal perspective. Because in Africa, the term national security is often abused by leaders. It's often a very broad and vague term, even when you look at various national laws. I'll give you an example from my country, in Botswana. There was a case in which a newspaper wrote about something concerning a national strike, and they published a document which was regarded as secret and a threat to national security, but it was only a paper on wage negotiations. And the matter was obviously withdrawn from court because it did not make sense. So this is an example of abuse of the term national security. And also, you find that quite often what you regard as secretive national security documents or issues is information that is in the public domain elsewhere. Like if you take publications like Jane's Defense Weekly, because you buy your weapons from overseas, and those countries have got the records. So they can easily publish that information, which you will penalize your people in Africa for disclosing while it is public elsewhere. And the other thing is that I find it strange that though national security also has an economic dimension, shortage of foodstuff or food, for instance, in Africa is not regarded as an issue of national security, whereas it's a serious national security issue. And then we talk about anti-establishment groups. But these are groups that are constitutionally constituted. I don't find anything wrong with political organizations or groups that do not agree with the established or mainstream view. That is the right as established by law. And then you spoke about low-cost, free social media and you found that to be a problem. That is regrettable, because it's also within the right of these people to use social media. It's a constitutional right. You talk about national disturbances, also postulated from social media. That is old school anachronistic thinking. That is out of step with comparative international law. And then also there are instruments, international instruments, serious international instruments of law that countries such as Zimbabwe have committed themselves to. You've got the jurisprudence of the Human Committee on Human Rights. You've got the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And maybe you'll accuse me of citing those which are Western, but these are international that we have bound ourselves with. Let me quote for you the one from Africa, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which also got a rich human rights jurisprudence, which Zimbabwe is also a signatory to. All these conventions go against the arguments that you've just presented. Finally, your arguments are against comparative international law, and they cannot stand the scrutiny of the law in any serious court of law. I believe in Zimbabwe, the courts to some extent are still independent. I remember the days of Justice Gabi, who wreaked havoc in dispensing the law as was required by the Constitution. I think that the army should focus on cybersecurity, which is a serious right, as you have seen in countries like Russia and in other countries disrupting national elections. But I'm heartened by what you said in the end, that social media could be there to stay, and I agree that it must be properly regulated. However, I'm against overreach and authoritarian control by African leaders, because that is a violation of the Constitution and comparative international law and the international obligations that we have under international law. Thank you.
Okay, move on to the second question.
Thank you very much, Major General, for a wonderful presentation. My question is, I do believe that the issue of national security has to do with the issue of democracy. I believe that democracy should be implemented, and social media promotes democracy. But my question is, to what extent social media promotes democracy in Zimbabwe? I want you to strike a balance between the issue of national security, because I do discover that when people exercise their constitutional rights, they are regarded as threatening the national security. So please, can you strike a balance? Thank you.
Thank you, Major General Martin Chigondo, for your presentation. My point is not a question per se, but a contribution. We've noted lately at the dawn of this media revolution that we no longer have a physical threat per se as a threat. We now have what we call this social media or the media itself as a threat to social security. So my suggestion to your organization is that you invest more into cybersecurity. In terms of maybe the gadgets themselves, which you are going to use to care for the cyber war. And also, on another note, it's going to be very difficult, I know, for Zimbabwe, because you find that we've got other threats which are more important than the security itself. For example, what you just reiterated that we've got the issue of maybe we need to feed the masses of Zimbabwe, maybe in terms of hunger or something. So at the end of the day, we are going to sacrifice maybe the national security at the expense of feeding our own people. So I think it's a challenge to the whole of Zimbabwe, the organization, to look into the issue of investing in cybersecurity and training your soldiers also to behave or to be knowledgeable about the cybersecurity itself. Because we find that in most cases, if you train someone who is not knowledgeable in the military or in the army issues to be your security guide or to be your security guards, it might be a big problem. So in a way, I think the army themselves, they need to be taught or to be educated on the issues of cybersecurity. The soldiers themselves, not to employ other people, but the soldier, like what the army is, the Air Force is doing. You find most of them, they're going for their doctorate and they're going for they're doing their research, which is grounded on what they are doing in the Air Force. So I think that's what also you should do as Zimbabwe Defense Forces. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the contributions. Oh, okay, this one more. Okay.
Okay, my question is whether you could say anything about what's called the dark web. Is it a threat to Zimbabwe? Can anything be done about it?
Okay, Prof. Mapembe, you might want to repeat your question.
Okay. Right, the dark web, I was reading about it somewhere, and apparently what we know about the web, stuff we reach from Google and so on, it's only like a tip of the iceberg. Like 90% of the internet or something is what is called the dark web, and it is used for things like drugs, pedophilia networks, arms dealing, and so on. And it's sort of done with very encrypted websites and so on. You can only get onto it with special software and passwords. And so I've heard that the American government has got some software they're trying to penetrate it in order to deal with it. But what's happening in Zimbabwe about it, I don't know.
Okay, I can give this opportunity to the Major General to respond.
Through the MC, I want to thank the various delegates for the questions which they have advanced. And the starting point I have is that when we talk of national security, we must realize the fact that it is a collective responsibility. National security is not the responsibility of the military alone. It is your security, it is my security, security of your wife, security of your child, security of our nation. And collectively, we must all participate. The major challenge I have found with us, particularly we on the African continent, is polarity. We are so polarized to the extent that when one looks at the military, it is them as if the task they undertake is self-serving. And when the military looks at people out there, It's like we see them in the lenses of them being potential enemies. That's not what national security should be. You want to differentiate when we talk about security, which is the reason why jokingly I was saying my job is so secret. When you look at information, it is classified in two different categories. Open source information, that's what you are getting in your Gens Defense Weekly, in the various magazines, information about the strengths of armies, the equipment, their bought and so on. And as national security, we are not bothered about that because it's open source. And this is how you, as the citizens, will know how we as the defense forces are spending your money. Because this money we use for buying those weapons is taxpayers' money for performing the role of protecting your interests. The information which we become sensitive about is we sit in a boardroom planning Operation Restore Legacy. And before we implement it, you work together with us. It is out there in the meeting. That compromises the operation. And we will not take you kindly when it comes to that. Because it is going to jeopardize the lives of people who are going to be partaking in that operation. So, when it comes to the question of rights, freedoms, liberties, I cited cases of market stalls which were built in downtown Harare as a result of organizations trying to advance their aims. We have no problem with an individual going out into the streets to protest, as long as you are doing it responsibly. From our learned friends in the law fraternity, one of the provisions of law within the Constitution is that as you exercise your own rights, don't infringe upon the rights of others. And if you are going to bury a market store of a grandmother, gray-haired grandmother, looking after orphans from the AIDS pandemic, hand to mouth, you go and burn your ways. What effect is that going to have on the life of those people who are being looked after by that old grandmother? Could we condone such wonderful irresponsibility? So let it be very clear that we are not against the exercise of people's rights as enshrined in the Constitution, but the manner in which you do so must be responsible. Don't coerce and don't trample upon the rights of other people. Don't go and force much people to join your demonstration. So, from a national security perspective, we are very much aware that the democratic institution alone is one of the major promoters of national security. Our people are enlightened. They know their rights. They must exercise them, do so responsibly, and through that way, we promote democracy. Democracy is about a happy and a satisfied population, happy and a satisfied nationals who have rights to all they are entitled to. who positively contribute to the building of a sustainable nation. Through democracy, I think our job would even be lessened, because democracy is about responsibility, your responsibility and my responsibility. Together, we'll then come up with a more effective nation state, which can stand and compete effectively within the world system. The days of despotism are over in Africa. I think in this country, this is why we as the military, together with the population, engaged in Operation Restore Legacy. Anarchy had taken over, and we said no to anarchy. So, my brothers and sisters, the only one way I want to leave is that we have a responsibility. When we were fighting the war back then in the 70s, we used to say, to build Zimbabwe, iweneni tinebasa. We have a dual responsibility. We must work together so that we move forward. We must move away, learn to move away from this polarizing attitude of looking upon one another as adversaries. Yes, on the issues of enhancing security methods, I have my sister there who talked about cyber security. Yes, it is one of the areas we are heavily trying to invest in, which certainly should go some way in enhancing our national security. But like I indicated on my concluding remarks, it is very important that as a nation we develop some values, a value-based system in whatever we do. Controls will never be effective on their own. We as a people, must agree that trading pornography on the social media is an African. You don't want to know what your mother and your father were doing to create you. Huh? It's an African. So we must have values. Would you say to my granddaughter, she knows how to responsibly embrace and communicate with modern technology. Technology is not dead, but that technology must be used responsibly. The question brought by the doctor on the, you said the dark web. Certainly, that is a new area which has to be researched, invested, and studied. I think that's all I can say. And for that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your insightful questions. Gives a lot of food for thought. But also, for myself, I say, you and us have a responsibility to move our countries forward. Thank you.
Okay, I think to conclude, we can say Nebasa, like what the General was saying. Okay, we can give another round of applause to Major General. Okay, well, we are moving on to our second presentation. which is going to come from Ms. Teresa Nopiera Pinto. She is a PhD candidate with Nova University of Lisbon in Portugal. She's going to present on popular protests in Zimbabwe, mobilization, repression, and occupation of alternative spaces. Over to you, Ms. Teresa.
So, good morning, and first of all, let me say that it's a pleasure and a great opportunity for me as a PhD student doing research about Zimbabwe to be here today. And maybe my presentation will be another perspective about the same topic that we've been talking about. And so I apologize in advance for any inconvenience. I'm studying global studies, and my challenge was to find a research topic that would connect a global trend, like the emergence of a global virtual civil society, with local realities. And so I decided to look at the protests in Zimbabwe between 2016 and 2017, and try to understand to what extent virtual and physical protests can be triggers or accelerators of political change. And so we see that in the country between April 2016 and December 2017, there was a significant increase in the popular contestation to the government. And in this protest cycle, reflecting a global tendency, claims were not only expressed through marches, demonstrations, and strikes, but also through the systematic resort to social media as platforms for debate, for mobilization and coordination of the protests, and for projection of discontent on a potentially global scale. And so my research led me to three preliminary conclusions. And the first one was that we can say that these protests that happened between April 2016 and December 2017 can be considered a protest cycle. And according to C.D. Terrell, who studied protest cycles and contentious politics, a protest cycle exists whenever the protests are diffused to several sectors of the population, they are highly organized, and they are used as the instrument to put forward demands. But at the same time, these protests react to a certain structure of opportunities, that is to say, to the opportunities, to the constraints, and to the threats presented by the governments to the protesters. So that's why I was saying that this is another perspective of what we've been talking about. And the second conclusion is that the main feature of these protests reflects both national realities and global tendencies, including the increasing relevance of the virtual civil society. And finally, the dynamics of repression and mobilization. And repression and mobilization is something that happens in every protest cycle, whether in the United States or in Tunisia or in Zimbabwe. In the case of Zimbabwe, it resulted not in demobilization, so people did not react to repression by demobilizing, but by searching for alternative spaces and alternative forms of contestation, and sometimes with a great creativity. So for a more global perspective and briefly, we see that since 2005, there has been an increase in the number and in the intensity of popular protests around the world. Between 2006 and 2013, for example, there were protests in 87 countries spread over 5 continents, covering over 90% of the world population. And these protests assume different forms, including marches, occupations, acts of civil disobedience, and food riots. Cross-cutting different political and economic contexts, these post-2005 protests are different from the protest movements of the 90s. So in the 90s, the protest movements were mainly about transnational causes, against globalization, environmental concerns, and now the protests seem to be more localized. At the same time, these protests are mostly driven by national or local political and economic circumstances. And protesters predominantly challenge state institutions or governments, and they try to relocate the center of political action to the streets. But at the same time, while this is about street politics or being physically involved in protests, a defining feature of this new wave of protests is the systematic use of social media. So I wanted to understand to what extent this was revolutionary or not. In the case of Africa, and always bear in mind that Africa is a continent, but I think that in this case we can generalize, the post-2005 period corresponds to what Adam Branch and Zechariah Manfili define as a third wave of protests. And this started at the beginning of the 21st century and swept the continent from Cape to Cairo, passing through Kenya, Burkina Faso, Uganda, Ethiopia, or Nigeria. And we see that, again, a defining feature of this third wave in Africa is its double nature, both material, as in street politics involving the physical participation of protesters, but also virtual through the systematic utilization of social media platforms. So we see that while citizens in Burkina Faso, Congo, Uganda, or Cameroon took to the streets in protest, different slogans were widely diffused on social media. Nkurunziza bye-bye, Sasufi, Kabila must go are some examples in a continent where in 2015, 1 in each 10 hashtags had political meaning, compared with only 2 in each 100 in the UK or in the US. But at the same time, we see that collective action, whether it's physical or virtual, is always a dynamic phenomenon. It may lead to very different outcomes, from a minimum impact, reforms, or a revolution. So I think that it's important to think about these protests, and there are some questions. First, do they represent a new form of doing politics? Second, have they contributed to advances in democracy? And third, to what extent social media platforms have worked as liberation technologies, that is to say, as instruments to advance democracy? Because we see that some protest cycles have triggered major political transformations. It was the case in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Ukraine, in Burkina Faso, and even in Greece or Brazil. But at the same time, and this seems a paradox, this period of popular uprising, both online and offline, coincides with what some authors, like Larry Diamond, for example, define as a moment of democratic recession. And in fact, according to the 2018 Freedom in the World report, and I quote, democracy faced its most serious crisis in decades in 2017 as its basic tenets came under attack around the world. Now, looking at the Zimbabwean case, the 2016-2017 protests seem to have been driven by a combination of factors. High unemployment, particularly among the youth, increasing restrictions on the activities of informal traders, the introduction of bond notes, and so on. And one of the challenges faced by the protesters was the progressive reduction of the conventional and legal contestation spaces. And this happens not only because of the repression mobilization dynamics, which again is something common to every protest cycle, but also because of the informalization of the country's economy. So the trade unions were perhaps weaker, so it was more difficult to organize legal and conventional protests. But what we see is that although initially focused on specific claims, mobilized civil society organizations, like the National Vendors Union of Zimbabwe, protest movements like Tajamuka, This Flag or This Gown, or the action of individual activists represented a visible challenge to President Robert Mugabe in the last years of his rule. In this case, the crucial actor was an anonymous citizen, Pastor Ivan Mawarire, that decided to post a video on YouTube. You know this story better than me. And he expressed his frustration about the state of the country wearing the Zimbabwean flag. And his gestures were repeated not only by Zimbabweans in the country, but also in the diaspora. And what is interesting about this flag movement is that it was totally spontaneous. It was an absolutely online movement, and it was not initially structurally or ideologically connected to any party. And at the same time, it was nationalist because it resorted to the national symbols and to a rhetoric of liberation. So I think that it's interesting to look at this example of a virtual social movement. Now, considering physical protests, we see that between January and August 2016, there were around 40 protests organized by movements or civil society organizations to contest Zimbabwe's political and economic governance. And I'll give a brief list of examples. On April 14, 2016, thousands marched against unemployment, poverty, and corruption. On June 24, 2016, the Tajamuka movement, members of the Navus and of the Restoration of Human Rights organization protested at the door of the Rainbow Towers Hotel. On July 1, protests erupted in Beitbridge against the restrictions imposed by the government on South African imports. And on July 6, Harare saw one of the largest popular demonstrations of the last decade. Under the hashtag #ZimShutdown, the Disflag and Tajamuka movements organized the national stay away that led to the closure of banks, schools, and shops. On July 16, in the city of Bulawayo, around 2,000 women participated in a protest, beating empty pots and chanting slogans against the president. Some days later in Harare, the Zimbabwe Coalition for Unemployed Graduates announced the protest under the slogan and hashtag "This Down Demands Job." There was a new round of protests in August, and on September 1, evoking the 2007 Public Order and Security Act, the police authority banned all public demonstrations in Harare. 1 week later, however, the Zimbabwe's High Court declared that the ban was in violation of Article 86, paragraph 2 of the Constitution. And what is interesting is that this attempt to ban the August demonstrations reflects a tension between two different views about the protests. So on one side, we have the government that sees the protest as an illegal attempt to overthrow a legitimate government. But protesters see these collective actions as legitimate demonstrations and as the exercise of fundamental rights, which were protected by the Constitution. A defining feature of the Zimbabwean protest cycle was the search for and the appropriation of alternative spaces of contestation. And in this case, virtual spaces were particularly important. So while some authors consider that collective mobilization in the 21st century remains predominantly about street politics, about physical participation in protests, these protests are complemented by intense online campaigns. And we see, for example, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine or the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, and conclude that technology has not only become a prime tool for political and civic engagement, but also in some cases an accelerator of political change. And in Africa, and again, I think we can generalize in this case, where increasing mobile and internet penetration is having a dramatic impact on several sectors, the resort to ICT for social and political purposes is particularly relevant. And in the case of Zimbabwe, the complementarity between street and virtual protests is evident or reflected in the large impact and dissemination of hashtags like Disflag, Tajamuka ZimShutdown, This Down, Mugabe must fall, or Beat the Pot. So for parts of the Zimbabwean civil society, these virtual spaces, whether Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, or alternative spaces where sensitive issues could be more freely discussed. So it is useful in this context to use the concept of liberation technologies that is proposed by Larry Diamond, and means any form of information and communication technology that can expand political, social, and economic freedom. And so by resorting to social media, users can become more passive recipients, acting as journalists, commentators, or activists, and mobilizing fellow citizens. But at the same time, these networks of outrage and hope, they widen the action field of protesters, but they do not replace the collective and the physical mobilization that characterizes contentious politics. Because although this virtual civil society allows protesters to overcome conventional and physical barriers, the replacement of collective action by a connected action does not represent a sustainable alternative. And why? Because it often lacks the cohesive leaderships and the common identities necessary to form social movements, sustainable social movements. What is also interesting is to see that in Zimbabwe, and again, I think I'm presenting a different perspective, reflecting the double nature of the protests that were both physical and virtual, there was a restraint of digital freedom. So according to the Freedom in the House 2017 Freedom of the Net report, greater control over the country's ICT market and internet infrastructure, restrictions on WhatsApp during anti-government protests, and arrests for online activities constituted major obstacles to internet freedom in Zimbabwe. On July 6, for example, in 2016, the government blocked access to Twitter and WhatsApp, and the Postal and Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of Zimbabwe issued a warning against gross irresponsible use of social media and telecommunication services, stating that, and I quote, "Anyone generating, passing on, or sharing such abusive and subversive materials which are found tantamount to criminal behavior will be disconnected and the law will take its course, end of quotation. In October 2017, a new government ministry was created, the Ministry of Cybersecurity, Threat Detection and Mitigation, whose purpose was to deal with abuse and unlawful conduct in cyberspace. Now, before concluding, just going back to the theory, protest movements, the survival of protest movements depends on two conditions. The first is the attainment of significant scale, and the second, the capacity to create a collective identity. Scale demands the systematic reproduction of protests, both physically and virtually, in time and in space. Of course, that virtual protests are more easily reproducible. By joining together people that otherwise would be isolated, greater scales contribute to the creation of common identities. At the same time, by joining people of different genders, ages, ethnicities, or social backgrounds, protest movements can diversify and innovate their tactics and increase their resilience. And why? Because it becomes more difficult for the governments, any government, to resort to strategies of localized repression. However, in the case of the Zimbabwean protest cycle, diversity may have been both a strength and a weakness, because while it legitimized the contestation, it also compromised the movement's organizational capacities, because the common denominator between different protesters was simultaneously minimum and negative, that is to say, a rejection of the status quo. At the same time, the primacy of virtual contestation in some periods of the protest cycle also had negative effects, because the turn to desktop activism may degrade or may have degraded the experience of political participation, because it discourages full engagement in movements and in protests. So without regular face-to-face contact, it is more difficult for collectivists to build a sense of trust and internal unity that tends to characterize social movements. And at the same time, this increases the risks of demobilization in the medium term. But despite these limitations, and observing the 2016-2017 protest cycle, I think we can identify three important things. And the first was the creation of a broad and relatively heterogeneous support basis. The second, the capacity to advance the language of political rights and civil liberties. And finally, the capacity to forge strategic alliances. The judicial power, for example, acted in diverse moments as a restraint to preventive and reactive repression practices, affirming its independence, impartiality, and credibility. But the decisive alliance was between protesters and war veterans. Prior to the July 6th shutdown, the ZNLWVA held a press conference to express solidarity with the protesters. On July 21, in a moment when protests were reaching their peak, the ZNLWVA released a statement describing the president as a dictator and announcing that they would no longer support his rule. So in fact, I think war veterans would play a decisive role in the ousting of President Robert Mugabe. After a year of relative appeasement, the November 2017 protests in Harare and Bulawayo, convened by war veterans, marked the end of the president's leadership. Thousands of people went to the streets carrying slogans such as "I am a history maker," 18 November New Independence Day, or the hashtag Free Start. Concluding, the 2016-2017 protest cycle reflected both local, national, and global circumstances. For more than a year, different protest movements and civil society organizations with diverse claims and goals engaged in collective actions that represented the most visible challenge to the status quo, and specifically to President Robert Mugabe's rule. While the regimes resorted to both formal and informal repression mechanisms, thereby increasing the risks of contestation, this did not result in demobilization, but rather in adaptation, through the search for alternative spaces and forms of contestation. And in this context, internet usage and social media networks played a crucial role as platforms used for debates, mobilization, coordination, information dissemination, and projection of social discontent on a potentially global scale. However, it also became clear that while desktop activism can complement street-level politics, it cannot replace it as a driver of political change. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Teresa Pinto. For the sake of our time, we're going to move on to our third presentation, then we'll entertain questions at the end. So our third presentation is going to come from Mr. Sibanengi Ebuwe from University of Free State. His presentation is on role of social media in the election of a new government, Twitter, and Zimbabwe's 2013 elections. Okay, over to you, Mr. Ebuwe.
Okay. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll just do maybe just the last two slides with statistics. Good morning to your comrades and friends. As you may have seen, this presentation is a co-authored paper. It is co-authored by myself and Dr. Leonard Makome, who unfortunately today is not here with us. He is out on an international assignment. We are trying to look at the role that Twitter played in Zimbabwe's 2013 elections. And this project comes from my interaction with Dr. Makome for quite some time. In July of, just for some background, in July of 2010, Dr. Makome and myself co-founded an organization called Parliamentary Monitoring Trust, which is in existence. I think some of you might have met it on the different social media platforms. The idea then was to try and enhance political participation, transparency, accountability, through trying to harness citizen participation in political processes. Dr. Makome took that initiative a step further in 2013 when he registered for a PhD, which then looked at social media in political participation. And we derived this paper from that initiative. I think from the 2 days that we've had this, we now know what social media is. I may not spend a lot of time on that. And we also know the historical background of political participation. I'm glad Major General Chebulu is here. Only on Wednesday, when this demonstration over ZEC BVI was taking place, I saw a placard which said, "We fought for 1 man, 1 vote." One man, 1 vote, is it? So the political participation in Zimbabwe historically has always been contested. And the Major General Chebulu and company fought for political participation. Because at that time it was racially exclusive, we were racially excluded, racialized political participation during the liberation struggle. Then at independence, new forms of political exclusion also emerged. I think we had an agreement there. We saw even guns were shot here and there in trying to make sure that we expand political participation, even after independence. I'm sure you know about the shooting of Patrick Kombai and so on in the 90s. It was a contested terrain, the question of political participation. And it continued like that. The government was also keen to control even the media as a way of political participation. I'm sure you are well aware of historically the Broadcasting Act of 1957, which came into place to try and control what people get. And then in 2000, we have quite a number of legal instruments coming up to try and control political participation in Zimbabwe. to try and what we have called the legislated closure of political space since 2000. Most of us Zimbabweans are aware of IPA, we are aware of the Broadcasting Services Act, we are well aware of the Public Order and Security Act and the ways in which these platforms were trying to close the political space. And it is against this background that then we came up with Twitter. You can go to the next. As a way of trying to see how the emergence of social media changed the terrain of political participation. And I think you will agree with me here. Major General Chibundu has already highlighted that they are struggling to control social media, which means the social media presented an opportunity for us for citizens to participate in the Zimbabwean political process, to circumvent state controls in political participation. And our choice of Twitter was because we were looking at an election, the 2013 election, and Twitter allowed us to use specific hashtags that had to do with elections. For instance, we chose 4 hashtags. There was the Zimbabwe Decides, Zim Decides hashtag, there was Zim Elections hashtag, and there was, so it was Zim Decides Election, Zim Decides hashtag and Zim Elections hashtag. That also, we used those 2 hashtags. And they were specifically concerned about the 2013 election. And in terms of methodology, we collected a number of tweets over days, over 51 days. 25 days before the election, then 25 days after the election, to try and see what was happening. And in total, we managed to collect over 74,703 tweets so from those 4 hashtags, the 4 hashtags that we used. And as you can see from that graph, the tweets were constant, and that they peaked on the election day, and then they also they spiked on the election date, and then they came down and so on. So, from our analysis of the data that we managed to get, we realized that the top 10 tweet users were responsible for 47%, as you can see there, 47.63% of the tweets, of the total tweets for Zim Decides, and 62.75% for Zim Elections. So it became very clear to us that we are talking about how Twitter facilitates political participation, but we are saying the top 10 are responsible for 62. So which raises the question, does this really allow for political participation? Because the majority of the tweets were done by just the top 10 of tweeters. And we went on, you can go to the next one. We went on also to analyze further the top users, to say who was the top users. And as you can see on that one, the top users, NA, we couldn't identify who those were. But the top users were activists, whose frequency on that graph is 19. You also have individuals at 18. You look at both Zim Elections and Zim Decides. if you look at that, you will find that media-related organizations and activists were the most frequent Twitter users. And these are the people who already have access to media. So we also looked at which sources, what were they using, the information technologies that they were using. And as you can see there, web is responsible for 26.1% for Zim elections and 25.1% for Zim decides. And for you to have this web access, you need to have access to the internet. And I think on opening day, there was a presentation which told us about the internet penetration. Of course, the general also referred to it, but we know very well that not everybody in Zimbabwe, in fact, the large majority of Zimbabweans have no access to internet. And if you look at the other gadgets there, that's Twitter for BlackBerry, that's Twitter for iPhone, and so on and so on, as you can see there. So, from the analysis of the data that we found from a quantitative point of view, of course, qualitative, if you can go to the next. The topics that were covered were on elections, policies, personalities of candidates, media role, media role, and then the language that was being used was predominantly English, which also excludes quite some sections of the population who are not conversant in that language. Of course, we have also some Shona and Ndebele tweets, you find them there, but the dominant language according to our findings was English. So it is from that analysis of the data that we found that we came to the conclusion that contrary to what others have said with respect to Twitter and Iran, Moldova in 2009, in the Zimbabwean case, from our start, Twitter has a potential to facilitate public political participation, but this was not realized in Zimbabwe in 2013 because of structural restrictions and societal prejudices that debarred it. So, resultantly, Twitter ended as a site for struggle and conflict in attempts to control and entrench certain ideologies within society. I think those of us who managed to attend some of the sessions, breakaway sessions, on the day, there were humor, jokes, and what have you. There were papers of humor and jokes, which were also circulating on social media, and those were also circulating on Twitter. And we came up to this conclusion that Twitter has a potential, but in the Zimbabwe case, there were quite a number of restrictions from the gadgets that were used, the language that is used in Twitter, and so on. And this is, I will conclude this statement.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nduri. We can ask some questions. We have got questions to the last presentations. Maybe we can take 4 questions because we are now behind time. Questions and comments? I take it people want to go for tea, so they don't want to ask any questions. Okay. 1, 2, okay. 3. Okay, we can go ahead. We've got 3 questions, so we'll take those 3 questions.
What do you mean by popular protest? The word popular, what do you mean? Popular.
By popular protest?
Popular.
I mean popular in the streets, when groups of citizens mobilize and protest in the streets. It's not the whole of the population, but some groups of the population protest in the streets.
Okay, for the last presenter, I want to know whether if you had done your research on Facebook among Zimbabweans, you think you would have come to the same conclusions. And then secondly, I'm interested in the demographics of your research, like your 10 top tweets. Were these people based in Zimbabwe or in the diaspora? Because I have a sense that most of them would have been perhaps based outside the country. And that also would go on to cement the point that you are making, that the potential is there, but perhaps it is still dominated by those in the diaspora who take great interest in Zimbabwe politics.
I would respond and say, yes, we had quite a number tweeting from outside. It was predominantly South Africa, the UK, a bit of the United States, and some few regional countries in Africa, but the huge majority was from South Africa and the UK. And as for the, okay, we didn't look at the age groups and so on, which was a bit difficult to do. Then, but as you can see from, maybe if you saw from our table, the dominant ones are media-related people. It's either journalists or a media organization. If you add media-related participants in their different categories, you see that they are the ones who dominate the tweets. And then as for Facebook, I'm not sure we were fascinated by the Twitter revolution talk that was taking place, and our interest was on trying to find out what was happening. But I presume that the same gadgets that one requires for Twitter could be the same that one requires for Facebook, I'm sure. And I'm not sure about the data costs pertaining to Facebook and Twitter.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we can go ahead.
Okay, my question is directed towards Mrs. Pinto. In your research, as you are researching on the popular protest in Zimbabwe, I hope you have also looked into the issue of who is the driving force, like is there sponsors behind these virtual protests? Because in your paper, I noted that you only talked about the virtual protest itself, but there's a physical, like who's sponsoring them to come up with this virtual warfare protest kind of thing. So I hope you looked into it on your PhD research.
Yes, and I concluded that the opposition has a bit of responsibilities. But what I found interesting was that this included both students, street vendors, so it was a broad group of people from different backgrounds. Although the opposition seemed to have a role in keeping the protests.
Okay, and in your research, you never came across whereby even non-governmental organizations are also sponsoring.
Sorry?
In your research, Did you ever come across whereby the non-governmental organizations are also sponsoring this protest?
Yes, in my paper, yes, I mentioned that. This was a briefly version that I presented now, but I also mentioned non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations.
Okay. We can take the last question. Okay.
My question is the last presenter. The follow-up question that was asked in terms of the other social media that you can use. Twitter, if you check your the media of search in general,
You will notice that there was just a spike in the number of Twitter users in Zimbabwe around about the time one popular politician was moved from the Ministry of Information. At the time, most Zimbabweans were actually on Facebook, so you'd actually have gotten much more credible and useful information from Facebook, because particularly from a numbers perspective, most Zimbabweans were actually on Facebook. And I know the majority actually joined Twitter when programs actually left the Ministry of Information. And then, my other question is, in terms of the themes and perspectives, what emerged from your analysis? Because yes, we can talk about humor, but what were the emerging themes and perspectives really in terms of influencing policy or what was happening at any particular time in terms of what you analyze from here? Okay, thank you for that question. I'm not sure if indeed Twitter, people joined Twitter after Professor.
I didn't say people doing it. I said
all right, because from our research, it looks like Twitter became popular even in Zimbabwe in 2009, following the Twitter revolutions in Iran and some other areas. You can see the numbers increasing. Of course, they later on increased as we headed towards 2018. As for the other social media platforms, I think it's another area for another paper. Because remember, there's this talk about Twitter revolutions, not necessarily social media revolutions. There's this talk about Twitter revolutions. So our interest was to try and see how Twitter influenced 2013 Zimbabwe elections, participation in those elections. And for us, it was easier, unlike Facebook, as I said, you could follow the hashtags. Hashtag Zim decides, which is specifically about elections and the issues to do with elections. And from our findings, the tweets were generally, because people were using different means to air out their views. Those humors, jokes, and so on were meant to send a certain message. They were meant to send a certain message, either to potential voters or after the vote, about the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the election. So that's what we found out from our research. Thank you for the question. We will seriously consider other social media platforms like Facebook and so on to see how they have enhanced political participation. But in this case, we specifically look at Twitter. Thank you.
Okay, let me take this opportunity to thank all the presenters for this morning, and also all those who participated by giving us some questions and suggestions. You made this morning possible because of your contributions. Thank you very much. Can you give ourselves a round of applause? Okay, we just have one announcement to make. I'm sure we all got some evaluation forms. Can you kindly fill them in and drop them by the registration desk as you'll be going out? I want to give this time back to our Director of Ceremonies to direct us in terms of what is going to happen up to now.
Thank you, Dr. Sibanda, for chairing this session so admirably. I think she deserves a round of applause. Thank you. Just one point about the general's presentation. You forgot to mention one critical phrase after the presentation. Did you say Asante Sana? Thank you. Let me take this opportunity to announce the next stage of our program. We break for tea now. Let's give ourselves 30 minutes, and we proceed to the three respective venues that have been earmarked for the parallel sessions, G1, G2, G3. The respective chairs in those sessions will be Drs. Tsarwe and Masoa and Prof. Masiwa. So please, if we can immediately proceed to the three venues as soon as we are done with our tea. Let me repeat my earlier point, it's very critical. As soon as we are done with the three parallel sessions, and we are saying let's be done by 12:30, we proceed directly to this venue for the closing session before we break for lunch. I thank you.